BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNid88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the Teespring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin.
Alright, hello everybody. Today is Friday, another Anything Goes Friday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? This episode is going to be a follow-up to one that I put out last Sunday on the 1996 murder of Sharon Lapatka, and in case you didn't hear that episode, I'll just share a little bit of introductory information as to how I came onto the subject. I was reading the book Presumed Guilty by Stephen Singular, and he was discussing the crime, but he didn't provide any of the specifics, and he didn't even name Sharon Lapatka as a person. He didn't even use her name. So I wanted to know more about this particular case, and very easily I stumbled upon several sources online, and I made one episode, but I have to give a shout out to Plur P, who wrote into the channel saying, "There's an interesting movie semi-based on Sharon called Downloading Nancy, and that's what I will be discussing today. And the murder of Nancy Stockwell is the dramatization that was shared in the film Downloading Nancy, which stars Maria Bello as, well, Nancy is the name in the movie, and I can only understand that they gave her this particular name for the film because Sharon Lapatka used the name Nancy as an alias in real life. And this episode is going to be one where I'm going to be discussing elements from the film as well as elements from the true story, and I always think that this is an interesting mental exercise, but I'm going to make it available to people who have not watched the movie yet, as well as people who are not super familiar with the story, and introductory to everyone, as well as covering the ideas that are expressed in the story as opposed to microanalyzing the specific pieces of information. And I also want to remind you guys that a great way that you can help out this channel is just by hitting the like button, subscribing, sharing with your friends and family on social media if they're curious about true crime cases, and you can also go over to BuyMeACoffee.com. There's a link for that in the description box. BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNid88. And that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. Sharon Lapatka was someone who began corresponding with an individual named Robert Glass, and she began revealing very bizarre and twisted fantasies, and it's possible in the real-life setting that she actually wanted to be tortured to death. I mean, very clearly from the email trail, that is the idea that she expressed. In the true story, Robert Glass went on to be convicted for killing her. He was actually charged with manslaughter as opposed to murder. In his account, he said that he wasn't actually trying to murder her, he was asphyxiating her with a rope, and he didn't really want it to go that far, but ultimately he was found guilty of manslaughter because the police were looking at the email trail that was left behind, and the medical examiner was looking at how Sharon was killed, and the medical examiner was actually on the side of Robert Glass, saying that they thought that the crime was not exactly done intentionally, that his story was true about how he was asphyxiating her with a rope, but he didn't mean to take it that far. But ultimately, Robert Glass buried Sharon's body underneath a pile of soil that was about 75 feet from his home, and very easily discovered, and that led to the case and the trial and everything. But the movie Downloading Nancy is available here on YouTube for free. I did a search and it is available on Tubi as well. I watched it on YouTube for free. It stars Maria Bello as Nancy Stockwell. That's the name that she's given for the film. And Maria Bello is an actress that I really wanted to find a polite way to say this. She's good at playing roles with a lot of ferocity. Again, I'm just really trying to tone down the language. And if you do watch the film Downloading Nancy, it's one where they're talking about very, very dark and saddening things, but it's still enjoyable. As somebody once told me, we often turn toward movies and songs and music and maybe even the theater because we want to experience emotion. And it's not only one type of emotion, it's all across the board. And if you would like to weigh in the comment section about any of the ideas that will be discussed in this episode, I would love to read your comments. Maybe they will be used in a future episode on Black Box Online Radio. But from the beginning of the film, they're asking this question: why would somebody want someone else to torture them to death? And there were three answers that were given to that. Number one, I think the most obvious one that people are thinking about immediately would be that Nancy, or Sharon, whatever you want to call her, whichever name you'd like to attribute to her, I think that's relevant to the movie and the real story, that Nancy believed that the world was just cruel, miserable, and she was suffering, and it was a way out. It was a way out of suffering. She was a victim of physical abuse in her life, and this was a way to get away from it, to get away from the emotional and psychological trauma. Then there's a second reason that was said only in one line in the film, and that was that she wanted to enter some type of free-floating state where she would be outside of her body. And the third, again, only said in one sentence in the film, almost mumbled and out, was that she wanted to become one with a digital presence. Again, the real crime took place in 1996, and the movie came out in the new millennium, so 1996, that would be something that's very, very basic in terms of the internet and cyberspace, but for the movie coming out in the new millennium, that's a little bit more comprehensible. One thing, though, that I think they did in the film that was rather, well, interesting to watch, but it wasn't really discussed, was that there's this woman named Nancy who has this plan to have a man on the internet whom she's not married to torture her to death. But what they didn't seem to zone in on was she's definitely deranged. She's definitely out of touch with reality if she wants to have someone kill her so she can enter some type of free-floating state. I mean, those are not healthy things for someone to not only think about but put into action, and definitely the desire to put them into action, or having a blueprint and a plan to put them into action, and putting the steps in place to actually have this man kill her. I mean, it's not just about fantasizing at that point, and it's not just about contemplating it. She was actually doing it, and ultimately that led to Nancy's death. But what they didn't talk about in the movie is she's the one orchestrating everything. There's this person who is deranged, mentally ill, but she still has awareness of her faculties to the point where she can not only manipulate, but it goes beyond manipulating. She is calling all of the shots, and she found this guy on the internet, and they changed the name of Robert Glass for the film as well. His name was Lewis, and she finds this guy, and he's trying to connect with her and bond with her, and at one point he talks about how she's married. She's already married to somebody, and she's in an unhappy marriage, and she's resorting to things like cutting, self-mutilation, and she has these bizarre and twisted fantasies. And what he's talking to her about is, okay, you don't like your life, why don't you just get divorced? Why do you have to not only die, why do you have to end your life, but you want somebody else to end your life for you? You want to be tortured to death? And an explanation that, again, is shared in the film and somewhat of an undertone is Nancy was abused by her uncle very, very severely, in fact, damaging her body to a great extent. And instantly, some people are going to be thinking about that's just the recreation of destructive behaviors, repeating the cycle of destructive behaviors. And people will do this very frequently, especially when reviewing true crime cases, because they want to make it look like the suffering that they experienced is normal. They're trying to normalize that type of suffering and misery. And I think that the dramatization of Nancy Stockwell was showing that very, very clearly, even to the point where it's just this man named Lewis is trying to reach out to her, extend the olive branch, and just saying, I will be with you. I don't have to kill you. I can also love you. And she just says that she is incapable of being loved. And there's an element of self-hatred, but there's also a greater element of just how she wanted to make the suffering from her past into the present and into the future, and just go to the ultimate intensity, which would be death, because once she's passed away, she would no longer be able to experience any earthly emotion. And did she actually enter some type of floating state after she was um, after she was killed? I don't believe so. I mean, none of us truly know what happens after death, but I don't really think that the ideas that were shared by the dramatization were anything to do with an actual plan other than derangement, other than having some type of twisted ideas from someone who didn't have the strongest control of the faculties, of her mental faculties, but she's still holding on to the parts that allow her to make decisions and to consciously go through with the plan. And they will look at this stuff in court. When it comes to people trying to play the defense of not guilty by mental disease or defect, and Nancy wasn't involved with that because she passed away. I mean, she was dead. But in other cases, when people do use that defense, one thing they look at is, did the person have the ability to stop? Did the person have the ability to walk away? Did the person have an extended amount of time in between leaving their home and when the crime took place? Like, if somebody has traveled to commit a crime, well, I mean, they knew they were going there, they knew that they were going to commit the crime. That shows awareness of their mental faculties. It shows an intent to do this. They had the ability to stop. They had the ability to change their mind, and they still went through with it. So, with everything associated with the real life death of Sharon Lapatka and the death of Nancy Stockwell, this just is very much someone who was going out of control, and that the certain safety nets and resources that should have been in place in her life were not there. There's another interesting aspect of the film Downloading Nancy, and that is that she is seeing a therapist, and there are lots of conversations with the therapist that are shared, but I noticed that there was some deterioration in Nancy's mental state, and the therapist knows that there's deterioration in her mental state, yet there wasn't an enormous amount of action that was placed, or even trying to doing anything other than documenting it. Okay, well, my patient's getting worse, but what? And then absolutely nothing is done. There is a mini-series out there that is called The Hot Zone Anthrax. The season one of the Hot Zone was about Ebola, and season two was about anthrax, specifically about the anthrax killer and the prime suspect in the anthrax killer mystery, Bruce Ivans. I have a two-part response to that here on Black Box Online Radio, and it's almost the exact same scenario that is shared on screen, and that is that there are these conversations with a mental health professional, and the mental health professional is taking note of how this person's mental state is getting worse. They might be becoming a bigger danger to themselves and to the people around them. Yet, there isn't any real response that is given by the therapist. They're just sitting back and watching, and they're not even advising the person to make any changes in their life. They're not even trying to encourage the person to make any changes in their life. And I say this because in the film Downloading Nancy, the therapist openly says, well, I can't help you if you don't want to be helped. And she even tells her to get out of the therapist's office. Now, a big differentiation between Downloading Nancy and the Hot Zone Anthrax is Bruce Ivans' mental state in that particular miniseries was absolutely more dangerous, absolutely more out of control, and absolutely involving more people. And this is very relevant to something that I talk about on the channel a lot of the time. Some people deal with psychological trauma and they export the destructive behaviors. Other people deal with psychological trauma and they import the destructive behaviors. Import and export. And when we say exporting destructive behaviors, they're going to be the people who have had bad experiences, and their bad experiences affect their mental state. And they're going to go out and get into a fist fight, or they're going to go hurt somebody, or they're going to start a fire, or they're going to do something like tampering with somebody's car. They're exporting the destructive behaviors. Importing the destructive behaviors would be the alcoholics, the drug addicts, or in the case of Downloading Nancy, self-mutilation, particularly using razor blades in the film, as well as trying to get an accomplice to do these types of torturous acts to her. And I definitely think that's a big differentiation between Bruce Ivans, if he were indeed the anthrax killer. Some people believe that Bruce Ivans was absolutely framed for the anthrax killings. I have 3 episodes about the anthrax killer on this channel. Again, please like and subscribe if you want to follow along with these true crime discussions. And with Nancy Stockwell, there's an absolutely different take on the subject, because she's not exactly trying to hurt other people. Again, this is the dramatization. She's trying to get other people to inflict pain upon her. Masochism as opposed to sadism, and as opposed to sadomasochism as well, because some people want to feel the pain themselves, they want to hurt other people, but instead, with the film Downloading Nancy, it's mostly about having other people do it to her, again, trying to recreate the abuse that was brought on to her by her uncle, and none of that was directly stated. That's me putting 2 and 2 together and connecting the dots. However, I do have to note that the big difference between the film and the real-life event is that Robert Glass, also known as Bobby Glass, the man who committed the killing of Sharon Lapatka, was also charged with something very bad involving children and images on the internet. CP is what I call it here, because YouTube doesn't even want you saying those words. And they left that out of the dramatization Downloading Nancy, which I think is understandable, because that is just an absolute distraction. And that also, well, it just deviates from the whole idea that the person who committed the crime, Lewis, who committed the killing of Nancy Stockwell, was doing it because of her, as opposed to just being some type of twisted sex maniac, period. But to talk about the actual murder and killing of Sharon Lapatka, I would like to go to an article from the Washington Post that was contemporary. This was released in October of 1996. Slain woman's emails reveal violent intentions. And this was written by Fern Shun and Paul W. Valentine, just citing the source. And before I read the article, I will share another thing from my previous episode. The killing of Sharon Lapatka was the first time that an email trail, an electronic trail using emails, was examined by law enforcement as part of a forensic investigation. So that's how this case stands out in history. By internet standards, it wasn't unusual that Maryland resident Sharon Lapatka carried on sexually explicit, sometimes threatening conversations by computer with a North Carolina man known as Slowhand. But Lapatka knew their master-slave role-playing would go beyond virtual reality into a violent reality when she left her Carroll County home earlier this month, again 1996, to meet a man in North Carolina, police said. Authorities found her body last week in a shallow grave beside a rural North Carolina mobile home. And as I said, she was buried about 75 feet from this man's trailer. Lapatka, 35, left a note for her husband saying she would not be coming home again and not to go after the person that did this to her, according to affidavits released yesterday during a hearing for Robert Glass, age 45, who was charged in Lapatka's death. If my body is never retrieved, don't worry. Know that I am in peace, she wrote to her husband. Lapatka's electronic mail messages with Glass made it very clear that Lapatka knew the man was talking about sexually torturing and possibly killing her before she traveled the 361 miles from Hampstead to Lenoir, as said Sergeant Barry Lease, who supervises the computer crime section of the Maryland State Police. She went to see him. She stayed with him. She was not there against her will, said Caldwell County and North Carolina Sheriff Roger Hutchings. And I think it's a universally accepted fact that because of these emails, Sharon Lapatka was a willing participant in this. Same thing in Downloading Nancy, but how someone just voluntarily wanted to be tortured to death. And that does sound bizarre, but it's the same basic principle that we've been talking about, recreating the cycle of destructive behaviors, as well as trying to be free from the misery and cruelty of life. Lapatka appeared to have been strangled, according to the preliminary autopsy on her body found in a pit beside Glass's mobile home, Collettsville, near the Caldwell County town of Lenoir, in the mountainous western North Carolina region. Sergeant Chris Haas of the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation said, "The strangulation evidence is all we are releasing now." Glass was a computer systems analyst for a nearby Catawba County and was being held without bail at the Caldwell County Detention Center. A grand jury is to convene November 12th, and Glass's next court appearance is scheduled for November 18th. And as I previously stated, Robert Glass would insist that he did not plan on killing her, that it wasn't planned to go that far, that he accidentally strangled her too long, or asphyxiated her too long, rather. But, I mean, it really depends on who you believe, the medical examiner or the trail of emails, and I'm sure only he would know the truth. Glass, who has 3 children, was separated from his wife earlier this year. Neighbors told the Associated Press that Glass seemed to change, taking less interest in his home after his wife left him. A clerk in the criminal division of the state district court in Caldwell County said a search of local records found only that Glass had a speeding ticket in 1988 and was cited for having an expired automobile inspection sticker this year. Now, here is something that we do experience in the true crime world. Sometimes people have intense criminal records and they go on to become killers. They start out by shoplifting as a kid, then that leads to robbery and burglary, then it leads to assault, and then ultimately to murder. Other times, people don't have anything other than traffic violations like Robert Glass. And I think a lot of that might have to do with the internet. In this specific case, in this specific instance of Robert Glass killing Sharon Lapatka, that he had the computer, and that was a way for him to finally talk about all of these twisted things that he wants to do to women, as well as children, as horrible as that sounds. I mean, he was charged with something involving CP. So, now that he has the internet, he can unleash his perversions, and ultimately, that he used it as a destructive device, not a constructive one. I mean, I think the internet is very constructive most of the time. Sharon Lapatka left her Maryland home on October 13th, supposedly to visit friends in Georgia, and was reported missing on October 20th by her husband Victor Lapatka, found near her. And after Victor Lapatka, her husband, found her car near Pennsylvania Station in Baltimore. A man answering the telephone at the Lapatka home in Hampstead yesterday hung up immediately after a caller identified himself as a reporter. Sharon Lapatka, who had an internet-based business writing classified advertisements, left behind 870 pages of email messages from the last 4 to 6 weeks, according to Lise, who combined them with family permissions. Among the messages was a continuing dialogue with someone named Slowhand, in which Lapatka encouraged Glass's aggressive role-playing. And that's something that needs to be very clear, a differentiation between the real-life story of Sharon Lapatka and the film Downloading Nancy, about the figure that's based on the true events, inspired by the true events. As I said with Nancy in the film, she is calling all of the shots. This is all of her idea and design and plan, and again, she's encouraging this man named Lewis to do this. Whereas from reading this here with the real life story of Sharon Lapatka, that seems like this guy Robert Glass is revealing these fantasies, and he found someone who was willing to go along with them, and not only go along with it, but perhaps do even more. And again, 2 people connected, and their destructive tendencies were amplified because of the connection. They talked about what would happen when she came to see him, said Lise, and the method of the death was not made clear in the email. An attachment to the search warrant described by the items to be seized from Glass's home. It lists all items indicative of physical torture: leather straps, wires, rope, wooden frames, knives, skewers, pins, and soldering irons. Wow, this guy sounds like an absolute peach. That was sarcasm. So overall, it seems that with the film, they do have certain things that have been altered or changed, but movies do that because they want to share a particular point, and at the conclusion of Downloading Nancy, this isn't a spoiler, they put up the card at the end, even before the credits, that said inspired by true events, and I've always said it should go in this order. Number 1, based on a true story. Number 2, inspired by a true story. Number 3, based on true events. And number 4, inspired by true events, meaning they took a real story and they wanted to zone in on the specific aspects of the film, and they wanted to share that and to share this specific message with the audience. Now, if you do watch this one, there are lots of scenes of rough sex, there are lots of scenes of torturous sex, and I'm not even going to say too much about the details because of the YouTube censor bots. but at the same time, it's not done in a grotesque or gratuitous way. It's done because it's relevant to the story, and I think that it's much easier for them to create a narrative for a film about how the woman is the person masterminding everything, and in real life, the man is the person who is kind of encouraging her to do all of this, and then she's like, yeah, I'll do it, and I'll do even more, and because he has kind of given her the green light for it, then her destructive tendencies come out, but they come out on overdrive, and that wasn't something that he anticipated. No, I think that the movie wanted to zone in on that for a particular reason. However, it did make it very clear that there were some types of perversions that were present in the male figure, again called Lewis in the film, just not done in the exact way compared to that narrative shared in the Washington Post. But if anybody would like to watch the movie, it's called Downloading Nancy for Free on Tubi and YouTube, based on the real life death of Sharon Lapatka, and sometimes it can be called The Murder, but ultimately it was dropped from murder to manslaughter. However, I mean, I totally understand why it's a murder charge. Some of you might even be wondering if she voluntarily asked a man to kill her, or voluntarily agreed to have a man kill her, how could that be murder? Well, I mean, killing someone is still against the law. People aren't even allowed to participate in things like assisted suicides in all states. You are not allowed to kill people, and Robert Glass, also known as Lewis in the film, intended to kill her and went through with it and stated in written text that he meant to kill her. So that just leads us to the whole concept of, I mean, all those points are in place. Therefore, he was charged with murder and then goes down to a lesser charge, manslaughter. However, I would like to turn it over to you guys, and I want to know, what do you think about either the death of Sharon Lapatka or the film Downloading Nancy? What do you think about any of the statements that I've shared in this episode? What do you think about the claims expressed in Downloading Nancy about how someone wanted to be tortured to death so they could escape the world and live in a free floating state? What do you think about all of that? And also, what do you think about how movies change certain elements and try to recreate certain points that aren't necessarily true? Are there any ethical guidelines? I want to know everything that you guys are thinking. Please put your ideas in the comment section down below. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there is always BlackBoxNed88 over on Instagram. And I will see you there for the bonus podcast. Until next time.